Hi everyone, my name is Kwame Owino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a think tank based in Nairobi. So one of the things we've been trying to do this year is to identify interesting books and publications with policy consequence and to try to find the author where possible, but also to just discuss them and to see what they and just basically to understand some of the main ideas that affect development of the African continent generally, but also in Africa. So this afternoon in Kenya, I'm speaking to Edward Paice, who's the executive director of think tank based in London, the African Research Institute, and we are discussing an interesting book that we published this year in May. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Edward. Was it in May?
Last December, but a paperback, which I very much hope will be available in Nairobi and throughout East Africa, is being published right now. So this month.
So this is the book, Youthquake. It has a very nice cover, but for some reason I took it out and I couldn't find it. So Edward has written a couple of other books. He runs a think tank. So what we'll be doing here is in the next 50 minutes or so, we'll have a discussion about the content of these books. I have a couple of questions for him, and it'll be an easy flowing conversation. So Edward, you could start by an introduction of yourself, but my first question would be, why do you call this book Youthquake?
Kwame, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to have a chat. As you well know, but your listeners won't, you were one of the inspirations for this book. It was a column of yours in a national newspaper, which raised a number of the very important questions about demography, and specifically the demography of Kenya, that got me thinking. Now, over at Africa Research Institute, as you know, because we've been friends for years, we've always been very interested in numbers, in figures, whether it's to do with elections or the publication you yourself wrote for us about jobs in Kenya. Why was Kenya failing to create adequate numbers of decent jobs? Numbers have always been really important to us. And looking at population numbers, it struck me that aggregates were nearly always used, big figures for the whole continent. Now, I don't think people are very good at getting a grip on these big numbers and what they mean. I think you go above a certain number and people's eyes glaze over. Obviously not you as an economist, but I'm talking about a man and woman in the street. So when I saw a new set of figures for each individual country in Africa and what was going to happen by mid-century, two things struck me. One was the enormity of the change. It's often said there is a population explosion going on in Africa. I don't think it's an appropriate word. It is more of a sort of seismic shift. It has been going on for decades, almost unnoticed, both within the continent and outside, and it will continue for many decades more. So that was, in a sense, the genesis of the quake part of the title. It seemed to me more like an earthquake than an explosion. So what struck me was not only what was happening in the aggregate figures, but also the really huge heterogeneity of what's happening within the continent, both within regions and within countries and between countries. And, the demographic profiles of Eastern and Western Africa are completely different from that of Middle Africa, as the UN calls it. And all three are completely different from Southern Africa and Northern Africa. So this, again, it seemed to me to merit interrogation. Obviously, skilled demographers know all of this sort of thing, but I really wanted to write a book, a kind of general handbook for people both within and outside the continent who were seeking to cut through the sort of hyperbole and catastrophism that often accompanies any sort of press article about population growth anywhere in the world, and to actually break down the big totals and start looking country by country at what was going on. The youth part of the title, in a sense, is obvious in that you often see talk of a youth bulge in Africa. Again, I don't think the term is very appropriate. I think I've seen a demographer use the term chronic youthfulness, and that I think is a better term, using the word chronic not in any pejorative or rude sense, but as one uses it with a medical condition, i.e. it's persistent, it's there over a very long time. But even I, with perhaps greater familiarity than some, was really struck by just how youthful individual societies are. I mean, if we look at a country like Niger, 50% of the population is under the age of 14. These are figures that have really never been seen in demographic history before, you know, societies this young. So the youth part of the title, I think, you know, relatively self-explanatory. But also, there's another aspect to the quake as well, which was that, like you, I've been, my antenna are very attuned to protest across the continent. And, you know, life is not easy for the youth. These enormous numbers of young people across the continent, and protest is getting, it seems to me, I don't know whether statistically this is true, but more frequent than at any time since the early 90s. And as we're recording this discussion, you know, it's Berlin Wall Day, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and this sent sort of tremors right through Africa, as well as Eastern Europe, obviously, and provided a huge boost for multi-party democracy over the next few years, and for protest. And I think, you know, once again, we're in a phase of immense protest as frustrated young people are trying to secure hope and to secure a different social contract from governments. And I think that's a really interesting development. So that's a bit about why the book is, it took 2.5 years to write. I was working on it pretty much full time. Most of that was research. And that's a bit of background to the project and to the title.
Thanks a lot. So, I mean, for whoever is listening to this, my intention is not to present spoilers, but to actually give you more reason to think that in a 50-minute podcast, it's unlikely that we cover everything, but perhaps to whet your appetite to actually find yourself a copy and read it. We started with why the name Youthquake. But I think the interesting part about this is that, so you know, whoever's listening to us knows that we're talking about demography. An African demography. Now, there are two things that I find very, very interesting right now, because we read quite a lot globally. I mean, rather internationally, those who cover news, who cover public affairs, but also even scholars. It is almost it's accepted as truth that the next century is going to be an African century. And the reason being that it is taken that Africa's demography will grow and it's unprecedented. But what you're adding in terms of color is just basically that actually how young the African continent or most Africans will be. I also appreciate the fact that you emphasize throughout the book that Africa is not to be seen as necessarily one country or one place. I think many things are happening. So when we hear some of the spectacular reasons for which other countries or people who come from other continents are interested in the African continent, on the African continent, individual countries or Africa in general, they give the general view that, look, population forecast shows that the African continent will constitute 40% of population, I think in 2040 or 2045 or sooner. And then all that. So basically, the next will be the African continent, which I find very interesting. But I think as a demographer yourself, or someone who's examining the data, and I think I like the fact that you emphasize looking at the data. We know that there are perils and advantages of population forecasting. And I think population forecasting, and part of the way in which population and demography is framed tends to be things such as, yes, population explosion, and other carry words such as those. So I'd like you to, and you very carefully, I think you're very cautious in talking about this. So maybe would you let our viewers understand a little bit about what do you think are some of the perils and advantages of population forecasting? And I ask this being conscious that you actually say that many people or many institutions, professionals conduct forecasting, but you think that the United Nations Population Division has focus numbers are those in which you have the most confidence, and I think you examine for that reason. So please let us know why, because the arguments about population forecasting sometimes is one of the reasons why people think that, look, demographic arguments are often used for the purposes of scaring people. So please let us know, highlight for us, what are some of the perils and advantages of population forecasting, and of course, the performance of the UNPD in particular, which you cover in some of the chapters.
Well, thank you for raising that. It's a really interesting one, this. You know, the United Nations Population Division it's been called the greatest watcher of tides, or the most respected watcher of human tides. And it is the sort of gold standard source of demographic projections. But of course, if you're the industry leader, you're always open to attack. And one thing I tried to investigate in the book was whether attacks from other institutions, but also from kind of lone authors, were merited. And the evidence on this, it varies. Now, some of the criticism from other demographers is methodological. And I think this is quite healthy. And UNPD itself has shown itself to be really, I mean, for one reason, you know, all their demographers come from outside and do terms at the UN. So they've all been at other institutions elsewhere. And like any large body, they may not always take on board criticism fast, but the methodology used has been altered considerably over the last 20 years in response to criticisms of other experts. Some in the profession may say that UNPD hasn't changed enough, but I mean, it is at least, it would be unfair to say it is not open to challenges to its methodology. But if we come outside the profession of demography and consider, you know, books that may sell in a normal bookstore as opposed to in academia. Very often the UN is sort of attacked just because that makes good copy. It's sensationalist. You know, I disagree with the UN. I had a conversation, I mean, I'm only loosely paraphrasing a book here, which I won't name in public, but you know, there's one book on demography that came out not so long ago where the author says, I had a conversation with a professional woman in Kenya and in a cafe in Nairobi. And it just seemed to me that her views on fertility and how many children she was going to have showed that the UN was all wrong in its forecasts for the future. Now, this is someone, you know, just trying to make a name for themselves or to sell books. You know, the more sensationalist, the better. I haven't made it sound very sensationalist, that particular instance, but this was the general quality of the gathering of evidence. It was sort of, you know, I've had a conversation in Luanda and I think the UN's wrong on Angola. Yeah, this is not science. It's not even social science, never mind. I came into this with an open mind. If you look back statistically, then over 2 to 3 decades, the global projections of the UN are pretty good. The variances are not great. They're also pretty good for regions of the world where fertility is already at or below replacement level. That means that fertility rate, but that the average across a society replacement level fertility means 2.1 births per woman. And at that level of fertility, a society basically maintains its population. It's stable. There are, of course, many in the world, I mean, over 50 now, where fertility is below that level. The real difficulty in projections for anyone, whether it's UNPD or someone else, is with high fertility societies, of which there are a large number. Obviously, in Northern Africa and Southern Africa, fertility rates tend to be between 2 and 3. So they're towards the end of the demographic transition, and these societies are reaching some stability of population growth. Overall, there are obviously differences within. But when you have societies where the fertility rate is 6 or 7 births per woman and no fertility, there has been no change in that for decades, it's quite impossible to tell, you know, when a change might start. You know, is it going to happen in 2040 or 2050? So, and you can see this in UNPD projections since the year 2000, for example. They've consistently underestimated for Africa, because whereas in the sort of late 90s there was a sense that the whole continent was going into its own demographic transition and fertility coming down across the piece, as it was in Kenya, for example, at the time, because it was a major policy initiative in the country. You know, once fertility got to 8 births per woman, there was severe alarm with it, as you know better than I, within government circles about that. So there was a sense that, that fertility rates would be falling across the piece, as they did in parts of Asia a little earlier, you know, between 1 and 3 decades earlier. But that seldom materialized. Yeah. So whereas people were projecting at UNPD and elsewhere that fertility was on its way down, in many, many countries, it remained high. And so you end up, I mean, if we look at the projection for the whole continent for 2050, it's now increased that projection by about 40% since the year 2000. So in a sense, the country, the UNPD was caught on the hop, but for reasons that, I mean, demographic projection is still a great deal more accurate than economic forecasting or weather forecasting or anything else. But if you don't yet have a trend to follow, then it's difficult. Now, there are also frustrations. You've voiced to me before a frustration about Kenya, for example. It is known, you know, Kenya conducts good censuses. So why does the figure for 2019 in UN databases for the population not tally exactly with the census data, given that censuses are one of the prime sources for United Nations Population Division? Yeah, this is frustrating. I actually looked this morning before, and it seems to me that the figure for 2019 has now been lowered. In the latest population prospects from UNPD, it's showing us 50 million, and I think 49 million was the census figure. So it's closer than it was, because I think it was 52 or something for that. Why these anomalies occur, I don't know. I mean, they work the other way as well. The Russian demographers Korotayev and Zinkina pointed out back in 2012 that despite the demographic and health survey programs evidence on fertility, the UN Population Division was using fertility rates far lower, and that they were therefore bound to be caught out sooner or later, and that projections for Mozambique would have to be raised. And, you know, this was a public, within the world of demography, this was a public criticism. It wasn't hidden in some dusty corner. And lo and behold, you know, adjustments did have to be made. So I don't understand, given that DHS, Demographic and Health Survey data, along with census data, those are the two main props of United Nations Population Division projections. You know, you would hope that they were closer in all cases to, you know, to what the main evidence is saying. I just to finish off on that subject, I do so that, you know, there are swings and roundabouts here, and there are frustrations, but there's still no one better. And if we look at the grand scale of global population projections, the over, you know, 3 decades, it would be someone that, well, there are 1 or 2 quite brave people, but you'd have to be quite brave to pick a big fight with the UN on the global figure. Again, some people do it just because they, you know, it makes them sound, it attracts attention to what they're saying. Sometimes for ideological reasons they're doing it. But you know, there's still, even rivals have to work off UNPD data. That's
all right. So I think so we have 2 big conclusions. One of them is that the UNPD Population Division is the industry leader. For that reason, obviously, their numbers are the first point of call reference, but also that population forecasting is not oracular. I mean, it's very highly suggestive. I think you put in very carefully. It's constituted by people who take their work seriously and they're trying to forecast. But sometimes, yes, what they miss makes everybody think necessarily that either they have a political agenda, or sometimes that the science is not as exact as it is. And I think we mentioned for Kenya's case is that in 2019, I think most forecasts had it that Kenya's population would be about 52, 53 million. The real population was about 47 or 48, which was, in our view, a swing of 10%. Perhaps 10% is not too high, even if it means a lot of people, to be honest. That's my point. But the more important one is that you are reminding us that I think the UNPD takes their work seriously. They have professionals who come in, and the data that they have, in many ways, if you take it over the longer period, is far more accurate than anybody else. And then, of course, there's these economists. You're asking us to take that. Demographers, for all their faults, still forecast better than you do GDP growth. So we are chastised. We have to be very, very careful. And
I meant no offense to your profession. No, I meant no offense. But...
No, I mean, we take it. That's very important. It's true. I think that's a. So now we go to some of the main arguments. I mean, the main content. One of the things that will come out as a buzzword here is the phenomenon of the doubling dozen. Please explain what the doubling dozen means. As our listeners will know, doubling dozen is basically a set of countries with some peculiar demographic attributes, which means that their populations will double. Regardless of what happens now over the next, I think, generation. Very interesting. And the reason the doubling dozen is important is, as Edward already mentioned earlier, that Africa is not one, it's a very textured environment in terms of population and the demographic drivers. One of the things that you accept is basically death rates are actually dropping, mortality rates are dropping. Fertility rates are as well, but not as much. And for some of them, they've been stagnant for almost a generation for some countries. And immigration, in terms of determining African population outcomes in the next generation, is almost negligible. So we are concentrating here on the fact that for medical or other reasons, death rates are dropping, but fertility rates are not dropping enough to create the demographic transition or some stability. That notwithstanding, there are countries which have already attained demographic transition, basically in the southern parts and some of the in the north of Africa. But there's one place, mostly in the middle and to the west, the east and to the west, and some of the countries that you're going to speak to us about, the doubling dozen, are in that region. Please explain the doubling dozen.
Sure. Thanks for that. It actually ties in as well with your previous question about UNPD. You know, what I wanted to do was something a little different to just saying, well, this region's doing that and that region's doing that, and actually look at it by country. And the real engine room of population growth in the continent is fueled by by 12 countries. And what I began with was to isolate those countries where population growth per annum was 3% or higher. And at that rate, a population doubles about every 24 years, 23, 24 years. And I added in a couple of countries that were on 2.9%, and Nigeria, which is on 2.6%, because it is the behemoth. It's the most populous country. And so this gave me a dozen countries, and all of which, as you rightly say, were projected to double their populations by the middle of the century. Now, roughly speaking, these 12 countries account for a little more than 40% of the population of the whole continent, and are projected to account for more than 50%, just in these 12 countries, of the growth over the next 3 decades to mid-century. And I wanted to, get a better feel for what was going on in each country. And as you know from the book, I used demographic and health survey data to look at all sorts of factors, from female education levels to female empowerment measures. All of this data is provided by demographic and health survey data, which is, provided. Demographic and health surveys are conducted by national bureaus of statistics in cooperation with ICF Macro, an institution in the States. And they've been going since the early 80s, and they're the most phenomenal source of information, not just on sort of what one might call pure demography, but also on lifestyle. Now, I wanted to get a feel for what was happening within those countries, but also, and this is where it links back to your previous question, to stress test the projections in UNPD's latest population prospect against what was happening on the ground. Now, the sort of question that I was setting myself was, right, if there has been no change in the fertility rate of Niger for the last 30 years, it remains at over 7 births per woman. What is there to suggest that the fertility rate will fall by nearly 3 births per woman? And so that I asked these questions of each of the dozen fast-growing countries that I'd isolated, and the findings were quite interesting because, you know, in the case of Niger, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and Chad, there is no evidential basis yet for a decline in fertility, because fertility hasn't declined over the last, numerous decades. And so here we are caught in this slight conundrum, again, of it being very hard to run projections and forecasts for countries that haven't actually commenced a fertility transition. So as we sit now, today, the odds would be on projections for those 4 countries out of the 12 to have to be raised, because every year that goes on, or every 5 years, and there's still no change in fertility, the higher the population is going to be. In Mozambique, a fifth of the 12, there was really very little sign of a meaningful fertility transition being underway, but inklings of evidence that maybe one was starting. So my jury, as it were, was out on that. Had very, very slow fertility declines in identifiable in Angola, Tanzania, and Nigeria, raising the question for those countries of whether a projected fertility decline over these to mid-century of about 2 births per woman was actually realistic, because again, it's quite a fast fertility decline. Now, we could speak, all afternoon about the inefficacy of family planning programs in Nigeria, and I'm saying that in a wholly non-judgmental way. I mean, it is for that country and for its citizens to decide what they want to do in terms of family planning. But I mean, modern contraceptive usage rates are so low that you simply cannot kickstart a major fertility transition without much higher rates of usage of modern contraception. As you know, there are many other factors that feed into it as well, and people tend to have fewer children in urban settings than rural settings and so forth. But nowhere in the world has ever achieved a fertility transition with contraceptive usage rates as low as Nigeria. I mean, it's just impossible. So that was another 3. Now, in the book, I said clearly rapid fertility transitions were underway in 3 more countries, Zambia, Burundi, and Uganda. And to that, I would now, my jury was out, but in terms of data that's come to light since publication, I would add Burkina Faso to that as well. So overall, if I wasn't trying to make the case, I was trying to do 2 things. One, going back to just showing more, a bit of detail about the moving parts relating to demography of these individual countries, because I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating for its own citizens, never mind me as an outsider, to have greater access to this information. And it tells one a lot about, government and efficacy of policy implementation, and all sorts of things. So that was one thing. But the other conclusion that came out was that sitting here now, across those 12 countries, that the likelihood is that the figures would be going up rather than down. Now, I wasn't trying to make a sensational case here. I mean, some would say UN completely wrong yet again in forecast for Africa 2050, because I say this. And that wasn't the point. The point actually was more the opposite. It was to say, it was almost to counter certain voices out there who are saying that the UN has always been accused of overestimating, over-projecting, always. And people do that for various different reasons, some political and ideological, and we've touched on that subject. But basically, my conclusion, it is very unlikely that their current projection for the whole of Africa is going to be way too high. And the sort of window of variance is narrowing anyway. The fertility rate for the whole of Africa is 4.3 births or whatever. UN provide in their vast outpouring of data a set of statistics that simulate what would happen if today the fertility rate fell to replacement level, and they do the opposite, a constant fertility rate, so that if it didn't fall at all. But so if fertility fell across the aggregate figure for Africa fell today to 2.1 births instead of 4.3, the figure for Africa, the projection for Africa in 2050, would still be over 2 billion as against their figure of 2.5 billion. So, and that's going up and up and up and closer to the projection, every year. So, yeah, that was the genesis of the doubling dozen. I wanted to look at things a little bit differently, chose the fastest growers, wanted to go in there and look at the information on all sorts of things, from female education to the efficacy of sex education in those countries and so forth, with a view basically not only to learning a bit more of the demographic detail and to counter this, well, to enrich the picture of heterogeneity across the continent, but also to sort of in a way stress test the UNPD projections for the whole continent. Now, they'll still be way out on some countries. I mean, if, say, DRC over the next, there's no evidence for it starting, but commenced a rapid fertility transition over the next year or two, then the current projection would be too high. But, you have to look at other details. And that was another point of the doubling dozen. I keep coming back to this. I'm sorry for repeating myself. But, if you look at women's preferences, I mean, at the moment in DRC, women who have completed secondary education, still the fertility rate among them is still 6 births. So one's looking at very deep-seated sort of pronatal cultural attitudes in the country. Likewise, among the richest quintile in DRC, see very, very high fertility rate still. And so this raises another important issue, which is that you have to be very careful of any of these. Well, of course, female education is the key. Sure, female education is very important in driving a fertility transition. So is contraception. But the mix of these factors, economic development, socio-economic development being another, the mix that applies in each country is completely different. I mean, completely different. And, then if you want to look at South Africa and how South Africa got to 2.1 to replacement level birth, well, the answer is in apartheid. Your government system and basically a sort of mass program that was deliberately designed to ensure that there wasn't a population explosion and that family planning was available to anyone, anywhere. And you could say that in the apartheid setting, there's a rather unpleasant undertone to that. But, That's the difference there. But then they're not alone. I mean, Tunisia, if we go to the north, country with a totally different history, were the first country in the continent really to embrace female empowerment in the early 60s after the revolution, and to take women's rights very seriously, and the provision of contraception, but also opening up the workplace to women, drove the fertility decline to close to replacement level there over time. So the factors are different everywhere, not only country by country, but within country as well. I mean, if you look at a fertility map, for example, of Nigeria, region or state by state, it's a fascinating patchwork. And it wouldn't be wholly wrong to say that fertility rates are high in the north, where most of the population are Muslim, and lower in the south, but where most of the population are Christian. But it's a bit of a generalization. And actually, this whole thing about Christian the birth rate of
Christian South and yes, Muslim North.
Muslim, it's just, doesn't apply. I mean, Iran implemented after the Ayatollah's revolution, implemented very soon after one of the most almost forced through a fertility transition, which to this day remains one of the fastest in the world. I mean, they literally collapsed fertility in Iran. So, religion is, you have to tread carefully. And likewise, there are many Christian communities where high numbers of children remain, very much proud.
I think the fascinating thing from what you've told me is that there can be a mix, which is very important, between culture, dictatorship, or the absence of freedom, and what it does to fertility, and especially in the whether a democracy or freedom, conditions of freedom exist to allow for fertility control, and government systems of all kinds choose preferences. And sometimes when they choose those preferences, of course, they can use like the apartheid government. In South Africa, you've talked about Tunisia, and you've talked about countries outside the African continent in which government preferences force some demographic change in ways that obviously are uncomfortable. So yes, regardless of, irrespective of whether your preference is for good population, modest population growth or not, I think when you mix it together with the politics of the country and the governance model of the country, sometimes it can give you very, very, regardless of what the result is, it can give you a very, very uncomfortable historical feeling about what it did. So I think that's true. Of the 12 countries that you mentioned, the Dublin dozen, let me just read them quickly. Again, the intention here is actually just to show how these countries are special because, well, today they constitute 40% of the total population in the African continent, but they'll be responsible for 50% of the growth in the next generation, of all the growth. And obviously Africa's population is going to double, so that's enormous. And some of them are small population countries that be even globally quite large countries based on the projections. So these are Niger, Uganda, Angola, the DRC, Burundi, Tanzania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mozambique, Zambia, and Nigeria. And in each of them, obviously, there are differences. But on the whole, I think the patterns of demographic growth based on the mid-range population projections suggest that they'll be pretty large countries in a while. In fact, in a growth factor measured between 1950 to 2050, based on the population projections, suggests that Niger in 2050 will be 25 times what it was in 1950. So within a generation, another 1 century, will have grown 50-fold. Nigeria, on the other hand, will be 11 times. So obviously, it ranges from 25 for Niger, 11 for Nigeria, 9 for Mali, and 16 for the DRC, which you mentioned as well. So it's a mixed bag, but those are huge population differences regardless. But the more important thing is that even if they begin to fall, and I think in terms of your stress testing, by saying that even if you keep it at replacement level, which is 2.1 children per woman, these populations are still going to be really, really large by virtue of the fact that already the number of young people in the population, that's part of what the Youthquake is, will be coming on within a generation or so into family formation, and that's going to determine the populations as well, because those people are already born. So that's an interesting. We go now towards, one other chapter that I find interesting was the chapter on demographic alchemy, and you could put that together. I like that because it was an interesting chapter to read, but also very well, the craftsmanship of the chapter title, which is demographic alchemy. And I think here you are speaking about the fact that there are all these buzzwords around demographic, or rather development in general, and they've come to the area of demography. So you hear stuff such as the demographic transition, the youth transition, the youth dividend, and that kind of stuff, which are meant to be like, many people think just like you can hack development, think that you can hack development, and also by manipulating one or two factors, a very mechanistic view of society. So please explain to us, I find the name and the content of this chapter very insightful. So please explain to us what it is you found here. It's chapter 14 in the book. Yeah.
Thank you very much for raising that. There are actually 3 chapters on the demographic dividend in the hardback version. I got quite carried away in the argument about the evolution of a theory. And those 3 chapters have been reduced to 2 in the paperback version. And I'm quite happy about that. And I decided to do that myself. It wasn't the publisher. It may be that by the end of those 3 chapters, the reader feels a little like a nail under a hammer, because, I ram home the point. The inspiration for this was, like you, attending event after event after event, and reading article after article after article, where the demographic dividend was mentioned, and Africa's going to have this tremendous demographic dividend. So I thought this needed very serious scrutiny, because certainly to me, traveling around the continent, listening to experts like yourself in each country, it seemed to me, in general, and a lot of youth voices are included in the book, that there was not much sign of in many countries, of life getting better for young people. In fact, and this goes back to the protest, it seemed to be, if anything, the worst. Things getting worse, and it becoming more and more striking that as education was, at least enrollment and number of years in education, were tending to be improving everywhere, yet job prospects seemed to be worsening. So I went back to the origins of the theory, and it is a very interesting theory. In a nutshell, demographic dividend theory, most famously probably associated with the names of David Bloom and Jeffrey Williamson, American public health academics, I think you would say. The basic idea was that if dependency rates improve rapidly in a society, in an economy, as they will do if a rapid fertility decline commences, and if you invest in your young people in terms of their health and their education and skills provision, and if there are jobs for them at the end to be productive workers, then the change in the age structure, i.e. by which you have more people of working age population and fewer children who are dependent, this will of itself provide an economic boost. And the theory was, in a sense, sort of proved, inverted commas, with a look at East Asia, the East Asian miracle. I would add here that the East Asian economic miracle wasn't even identified as the East Asian economic miracle until 1998, and it had already been, by World Bank economists, it had already been underway for 2.5 decades. So, this again is a caution about labeling. So in East Asia, quite substantial boosts following on from the demographic change and the lowering of dependency, quite considerable boosts to economic growth, or like incremental economic growth resulting from the demography was identified. Now, this was interesting theory. There are plenty of economists who have written, for instance, Professor Lipton in the UK, that one has to be very wary of economists metric modelling of this type. So this was not without it's a bit like UNPD projections. This demographic dividend theory, it's not adopted unquestioning by the profession, as you would expect. Fast forward from the late 90s, when Bloom and Williamson's original papers came out, to, well, only by a decade, and you have this situation where the fertility transition that had been predicted for right across Africa is not happening. So once again, there's one of these periodic upsurges, concern or worry amongst, let's be honest here, Western institutions and demographers, more than in the continent, about the fact that fertility is remaining high, population growth is remaining high. Oh my Lord, where's this going to end? So family planning as a whole had received a bit of a knock in the 1994 big population conference in Cairo, and mentioning family planning, had become slightly taboo. By 2010, this is a sort of potted history. There's a sort of resurgence of interest, and there's money. Money is provided by many of the same institutions as had always been associated. These are American family foundations and so forth, with the funding of family planning contraception drives in so-called third world countries. But also Bill Gates joins the fray. Says, if the continent carries on growing like this is just not good. So there's a resurgence of family planning activism, and demographic dividend theory is deployed as a new weapon of persuasion, effectively. So governments are told, African governments, if you are able to effect a rapid fertility decline and you do these other things, you will get an economic benefit that could be quite sizable. So it's a tool of persuasion, and you can see it's a think tank very reputable in Nairobi that has at least one that has an entire demographic dividend theory stream for which the funding comes from abroad, and these from the US. These similar things happened right across the continent. Think tanks were suddenly there was money to do demographic dividend research. Now, I'd have to say at this point that one of the things that has become clear is that even if you use the same sort of modelling process, there's no other part of the world for which a demographic dividend has been identified, such as that was originally identified by Bloom and Williamson in East Asia. So Latin America hasn't had a boom. There are plenty of very eminent South African economists and development economists who'll say, well, we're at replacement fertility. Fertility fell pretty fast here. There's no demographic dividend measurable here, I can tell you. So this raises another issue of whether this is a bit of a chimera, a bit of an illusion. Now, stage 3 of the history, sorry, if I can just sort of finish off, is at the same time, you have the Africa Rising narrative soon after demographic dividend theory is being deployed to try and persuade governments to reintroduce or revitalize family planning programs. By 2012, Africa Rising is all the rage. Come out well from after the global financial crash. It was riding the booming commodity prices. People were frantically estimating how big the middle class was across the continent, and there was a general, buoyant mood, not only in many countries, but certainly as far as external investors were concerned. And that was great. Into this step president across the continent and government ministers who choose to interpret their very large youth populations as being a demographic dividend. So you would go to a World Economic Forum meeting or something, and then the president would say, well, you see, we have this fantastic demographic dividend, all these young people. Well, I'm afraid that's not what a demographic dividend was. Yeah. And I won't go on and on. The purpose of these 3 chapters, sort of culminates with the fact that the term has become completely undermined by being used by the speaker for whatever purpose they want. Yeah. I mean, when the big AU demographic dividend document came out in, I can't remember, it was 2016 or something, only 2 presidents out of the 46 to sign the document mentioned fertility in their little subject piece. They had got, one of them was Paul Biya in Cameroon. I forget who the other was, but they understood that there was no prospect of a demographic dividend without a rapid fall in fertility. That is the sine qua non. That is what starts the whole thing off. Everybody else, presidents, said, we've got so many young people, it's fantastic. And as you well know, the working age population in Africa by mid-century is going to be 1/3 of the total working age population of the world. But the fact is that unless you equip these people with reasonable health, reasonable education, some skills, or and above all, perhaps with opportunity, then these people are unfortunate because they're just lumpen extras, as it were, as opposed to being productive human beings living with hope, aspiration, and able to improve their lot. So the end was that of these 3 chapters was that, you know, the demographic dividend, the alchemy was that it had changed. It had morphed over a very short period, 15 years, through various identities. You know, it had morphed into a sort of persuasive argument for fertility reduction, into part of a president's toolkit to be singing his country's praises on the international stage. And in the end, the term has become, I mean, you'll hear people, it's not entirely clear even whether it relates to, whether it's a percentage or relates to a demographic structure or whatever. You haven't even got the same unit of measurement anymore of, which way back with Bloom and Williamson, you know, this was quite clearly about incremental economic growth as a result of a demographic dividend measured in percentage. And wanted to transfer that into billions of dollars, you could. But so we've come a long way from where it started. And as you say, I think you said in a previous conversation with me that this is sort of symptomatic of development by mantra or development by catchphrase. But it became an industry. You know, demographic dividend is an industry and remains so.
I think it's an industry, and I think as well. I mean, as we are here, of course, there's a COP27 in Egypt on the African continent as well. We see undertones of course, and there are famines. So we see undertones of part of the other reason why there's a new resurgence to family planning and population control or fertility control in general is aligning demography to the environmental causes, the belief being that obviously all that. So yes, I think demography, just like this, is a handy tool for whoever wants to use, and it's always possible because motivated reasoning is a human function, especially in policy discussion. And one of the things people do is to apply what the phrases are, the buzz is, but they also always apply this question of population to whatever their issue of the moment is. Now we're coming towards the end, and let me try and say this. I've read, in preparation for a meeting today, reviews on the book, and quite a number of them. So let me try and characterize. I see one, African scholars or people who are concerned about demography in Africa, many of whom say, look, the argument of identity. Look, why is Edward sitting in London telling us what African population trajectories should be? The belief very prominent on this continent today that African causes and African voices should lead in any scholarship on questions of importance to Africa, and especially the demographic one. So they're not interacting with the material. I think they're concerned about the identity of who it is and the belief that, look, you might be preaching to us or telling us something that Africans should be saying themselves. So that's one group. The second group of people, mostly European, or in other parts of the world outside the African continent, are those who says we always knew, we are ruined because the fertility question in Africa, that's all they've done. They either kill each other or they do. So it's part of that narrative of, look, what else happens on this continent and their development. So we warrant it, and these are some of the people who probably would be saying, let's build barriers, because this fertility growth would be a threat politically to European populations and specifically people wanting to control. It's also very instrumentalized. And the third point, I think they tend to be technical people who then ask, but Edward, you're not telling us what to do then. So we have the people who say, look, you're not African to the extent that it is defined by borders. The second group of people are those who are on panic mode. And the third were telling us that, right, you've told us a fantastic demolition job. You've told us that this is a complex subject, but we always knew. What else do you want governments or people to do? So the third part is, how do we instrumentalize this knowledge? The second part is, let's close the borders. And the first ones are, if you're African, I would listen to you. What's your response?
Oh, tricky question. Demography is contentious, always. It always has been. And I knew that however objective and non-prescriptive I was, that some reviewers would, that I'd attract criticism. And that's absolutely fine. And none of it has been, none of it's been sort of unpleasant. If I deal first with the sort of the great replacement theory type argument that Europe's going to be swamped by African populations being forced by climate change or anything else one reviewer accused me of cowardice for not saying that this was inevitable. Well, I'm sorry, it's just, if you're reviewing a book, you have to review the book that was written. And this was a handbook. So if the individual concerned then wants to waive my book and say, I'm right because, here's the background data and everything, then fine. I mean, I'd rather it wasn't used in that way, but I can't determine how readers will interpret the data that's in the book. There's no inevitability about this issue anyway. So, and it's a time-honored argument, and people are free to criticize in that sort of way if they wish. But I think it slightly misses the point that this is a book to educate about demographic dynamics. Well, it's passed muster with leading global demographers who I respect. I won't embarrass them by naming any here, but the fundamental, for me, not trained as a demographer. I've had some tremendous comments that kind remarks and correspondence saying that methodologically there are no big holes in there, and that's I feel very grateful and pleased that is the case. Your number one and number three are quite closely linked. I mean, does a foreigner have the right to issue any commentary about African matters? Well, that's a live debate, and if as an individual you don't think they do, then you're entitled to that opinion. But what I would say, and this from reading the book, is that this is a handbook, and it is different from other demographic books that are, tend to be quite sensationalist and have very punchy conclusions. And I would just encourage people to take a look. I mean, it's there. It's meant to primarily to educate, and it's not prescriptive deliberately. I mean, this absence of a great overarching cymbals and drums conclusion was very deliberate. Doesn't necessarily make for a bestseller, but but I feel that that morally and everything, that was the right way to do. A very sensitive subject, this. For 60, 70 years, African governments, African individuals have been lectured to by outsiders on the subject of their populations. And I didn't want to add to that canon. I strongly believe that is not my place. But I hope that, were you in the Ministry of Planning in Senegal, that you might find this book quite interesting and quite helpful for the fact that it's written by somebody genuinely independent. I'm not paid. I don't get money from X or Y in America who fund family planning initiatives or anything like that. So, you know, it's resolutely non-ideological, this. I'm not in a pro-choice or anti-choice lobby or anything else. So I hoped that it would be of use as much within the continent as maybe to anyone. I mean, I gave a chat yesterday to talk to a leading firm of lawyers in the UK who are, you know, advise on people investing on FDI all across the continent. And you know, I'm pleased at this sort of approach that I get, that people think demography is important and want to understand the basics, which is all I aspire to offer, really. So, you know, I completely understand it. It's not for you to say that African demography matters. Well, I think it does matter to you all, but I mean, but it also matters to us. It matters to the whole human race because, you know, with Africa as 25% of the global population in mid-century, as against less than 10% in 1950, this is inevitably going to impact everything from, you know, geopolitics to food security, to trade flows, to you know, sport and fashion and literature. And my biggest conclusion really to the book is just open your eyes, whether you're in the continent or outside. Just think of these figures and start thinking of how the world in 2050 might be influenced by the fact that a quarter of the world you know, it lives in African countries, and because you can see, I mean, the Ministry of Defence in this country did a big sort of global, and I'm not deliberately picking on them, but you know, a big global trends report in 2018, in which demography, changing demography of the world, was hardly mentioned. And this was another point of my writing the book. Was it seemed to me so often, you know, even in academic study, that people weren't using demography, where it could be quite an interesting extra component to the work they were doing on election management or on, you know, health systems or whatever. And so I'm pleased to say that possibly the biggest, or the review that has been most seen by someone outside Africa, was the review by Professor Adam Tooze at Columbia University, that was who's also a columnist at the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and so forth. And he got this basic point: we've got to start thinking. Everyone's got to start thinking. And you know, there are two major indications why we should be doing this in going on sort of this month. One, as you've alluded to, is COP27. I don't know what's going to come out of this and so forth, but the power of Africa seems to me to be, you know, on the up. This you can see in the second example. So whatever the African countries managed to secure at COP, Africa is more and more and more on the radar in terms of geopolitics. And secondly, you know, if we look at the war in Ukraine and sort of scramble for endorsement from both Russia and Ukraine within Africa and by the US, and so, you know, the world, everything's changing, and 2050s, 30 years away, Berlin Wall falling. Look how the world's changed since that, and nobody would have predicted anything that's, you know, going on today. Nothing. I mean, we all love ball gazing, but one thing is pretty certain in all this, and that is that Africa will account for a quarter of the world's population. So what I'm trying to, you know, it's nothing sophisticated about this. It's just encouraging people to start thinking about that. It will be as near a fact as anything, and it will be both for good and for ill, and in different countries will be different aspects.
Yep. Okay. So yes, I think we right at the end of it. So whoever's watching this, I think you do yourself quite some justice to find a copy of the book, the hardcover version. I have a hardcover version, very kindly endorsed by Edward. But I also think that one of the reasons why I think it's one of my best readers for this year is because, well, I think chapter 1 starts with an argument in which yours truly was engaged with a Kenyan, very rich Kenyan businessman who's pro-natalist. And I think it sets the background for a debate among African people, or at least people who live on the African continent, about what its demography means and what are some of its potentials. I think what this book has told me, Edward, is that we are on the 9th of November when we record this. I think Africa, in my view, is going to be important, or should be important, in spite of its demography. So the demography is one thing. I think one other thing that it teaches is demography by itself is not destiny, but I think demography mixes with a lot of other things. And among the things that I noticed from the book is, look, there's quite a bit for the African continent to do, and especially these governments. Some governments don't even have regular censuses as happens, the demographic and health survey. So there's quite a bit of building to be done. And in that mix will be whatever demographic trajectories these countries take. And I think for people who think about development generally, globally, and human welfare, I think African countries individual and African countries in general will be part of that, because yes, regardless of what happens, in whatever circumstances, I think 1 in 4 people by the middle of this century will be African, as opposed to 1 in 10 in 1950. So that'll be definitely by itself a big change. And there are things that African people on their own must do, in fact, including recognizing this. One of the things that I think is, when you hear most of the conversations, as I started with, about African significance of Africa, it is just not necessarily just for fertility success. I think African countries need to do many, many more things, and governments concentrating on the core goods as opposed to being particularly vulnerable to fashions such as Africa rising on the one side and demographic dividend. There's no hacking development. And I think that development is important because Edward shows us that the African people matter. I think they want prosperity, they'll be entitled to it, but there'll also be people here. So creating jobs or making sure that there's value for the labor that will be here, the people that will be here, and providing public goods will be essential for it. So Edward, if you can give me a minute of your time to conclude this, what would you say?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to chat about this. And I would just like to add to what I was saying. I mean, I have also been very humbled by the compliments. Much more common have been very fulsome compliments from people at think tanks and just general readers and old friends right across the continent. And they recognize I'm not being prescriptive. And so that has been really reassuring and makes the thing worth doing, because ultimately, it's down to individual African countries, what they make, and governments, what they make of their populations. It's not, as I say, there's been enough prescription from outside, in my view, is to do this, do that. So just 3 very quick comments to conclude, which I think echo, at least 2 of them echo things you've just said, but so I won't go on. But demography is underutilized, and I'd encourage anyone across the continent to go on the internet and dial up the latest demographic and health survey for their country and see the information that is there, because it's just fascinating. And so it's a very good way, even if one's just a student. So at the early stages of one's career, just getting a better idea of one's own country. And it's like reading a census, it can be riveting. I know this isn't bedtime reading for people, I understand that, but there are many people who are, for whom demography, a little demography should be a part of their work, and it isn't. So that's my sort of first appeal, is to understand, how it can be useful. And it's not all about fertility. I mean, fertility is obviously the big issue, as it were, as far as Africa's trajectory at the moment goes in population terms. But in Demography and Health Surveys, there's a welter of other information about people's lives. Secondly, I have said, that the youth of Africa and its sheer size, I absolutely agree, demography is not destiny, but this just does guarantee greater prominence, I think, in all sorts of aspects around the world. I think Africa's been significantly marginalized by the West in many aspects for many, many years. And I think that sort of marginalization and patronizing in many instances, there's no place for that anymore. And last lesson, I think, or last conclusion is, when you're reading about, in the newspapers or whatever, about demography and population, beware hyperbole, beware exaggeration, and beware generalization. Because these abound, and actually, the demography of your country is as complex as anything else about your country, like its economic profile, etc. So I would caution anyone who, especially when very concrete conclusions come out of generalization, and so I think it's a soft end, but then the book ends softly. It's for the reader, wherever they are in the world. You only have to be interested in Africa, whether you're African or not, for there to be something of interest in there, I hope. And I don't presume to tell the reader exactly what they should take from the book. Thank you very much again.
Thanks a lot, Edward. I mean, my congratulations for you for the kind of work that's required. I think 3 years and a bit of work just to produce this text. I'm glad I had a copy, and for anybody who watches this, please take an opportunity. And the good thing about the book is actually you can read each of the chapters as if they were self-contained on their own. There's quite some material. It's better if you read the whole of it, but chapters on itself would be actually good for teaching or anything else. But as you say, the intention was to create literacy on demography and demography related to the African continent and African countries. I think if you read that, I am sure you'll be able to check that box. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we hope sooner than later the IU will find another author who's as gracious and prepared to speak to us and mentions our work here and there in the publication as well. So, Edward, thank you very much.
And thank you to